Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, it is possible that you know of my work with the BBC, but just to reassure you that I am actually also a proper person in the sense that I'm a professor of mathematics. And because I'm a professor of mathematics, it means I'm very used to looking out at a sea of obviously hungover students. So it makes quite a nice change to be looking at some obviously over-caffeinated adults today for a change. But yes, thank you for joining us. We have an extraordinary panel today joining us to talk about what we owe the future. We have William MacAskill, Associate Professor in Philosophy and Research Fellow at the Global Priorities Institute at the University of Oxford and Director of the Forethought Foundation for Global Priorities Research. Will is probably best known, though, for co-founding the Effective Altruism Movement, a project that aims to find the best ways to help others and to put them into practice. Also joining us today, because the correct number of Hannahs on any panel is 2, we have Hannah Ritchie, who is Head of Research at Our World in Data. Now, Hannah trained in environmental and geophysical sciences before specializing in data visualization, and her work has focused on global food systems, monitoring progress on sustainable development goals, and making big data accessible to advance progress on global problems. And then finally, joining us in the centre here, we have Jaan Tallinn, a computer programmer, an investor and philanthropist who is best known for being the founder of Skype. He is also a founding member of the Cambridge Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, and he's also really quite an extraordinary dancer. So thank you to all of you very much for joining us today. Now, I know that this may sound like we're having a session on existential dread, so I thought that we would start with reasons to be cheerful, just to kick us off. So Hannah, you have a new book coming out early next year, and in it you have a section that starts with the header, "There's no better time to be alive than today." Just talk me through that, if you could.
Yeah, so I think this probably goes counter to what a lot of us have heard today. But before we talk about the future, I think it's useful to take a look at where we've come historically. So when you look at basically any measure of human well-being, whether that's life expectancy, child mortality, extreme poverty, education, when you look at the progress we've made over the last few centuries, it's hard to deny that we're in the best position we've ever been in. So just some fundamental statistics. So if you go back to 1800, nearly half of newborns died before reaching the age of 5. Now that's dropped to less than 4%, which is obviously not okay, but we've seen dramatic progress there.
Over just 100 years?
200 years.
200, sorry.
Yeah, but most of that has actually happened in, say, the last 50 years. Extreme poverty, if you go back to 1800, around 80% of the world were living on less than $2 per day. That's now less than 10%. And I think we often have this intuition that this has only happened in rich countries and they've moved away, really far away from the rest of the world and they've been left behind. Well, there are still massive inequalities in these measures. It's not true that countries have not made progress. Basically, every country in the world has made progress on these fundamental measures of human well-being. They've just moved at very different rates.
How did things look then, that contrast between developed countries, sort of, let's say the Western world and elsewhere? Do you think that we have a sort of pessimism bias? Because I think that not many people would imagine that we are in a really great situation, even in those criteria that you're describing.
Yeah, so the guy that does data communication much better than me was Hans Rosling, and he used to show this, where there's a big disconnect from how we view progress in middle and low-income countries to what actually happened there. So, like basic fundamental questions of, has extreme poverty globally fallen or risen? Most people would say it's risen when it's fallen. So we often have this kind of really out-of-date perception that low-income countries or middle-income countries have just not made any progress over the last 50 years, and it's simply not true.
I guess also, if you are at a low income, a small difference actually as a percentage of what you have ends up being quite a big thing.
Yeah, the way we would demonstrate it is we would stand on a ladder and say, if you've got someone on $1 or $2 a day and you've got someone on $10 a day, we think of all those people as poor, and we just look down and we say, oh, they're all poor. But the difference between living on $1 to $2 a day and $10 a day is enormous.
So there are then, Will, reasons to be positive about about the world now. But what do you think that those trends that Hans just described might look like going forwards?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best guess is that those trends will continue. So kind of absent any sort of major catastrophe, I do expect the world to just keep getting richer. We've already seen like very fast growth within the poorest countries, so expect that to continue. By the end of the century, you'd have kind of everyone in the world, or almost everyone in the world, living the standard of life of us in kind of rich countries, and us in rich countries living kind of even happier lives again. The key questions, though, are like whether some of the negative trends might counteract that, such as developments in synthetic biology that could create pandemics much worse than COVID-19, or developments in AI that could pose existential catastrophes too, that I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute.
Absolutely. So, okay, saving disaster. We're on a good track. That's what I'm taking from this so far. I do wonder actually, and a lot of the conversation around how things feel as though they're bad now centers on that single assumption that we're in a world of scarcity. Need that necessarily be true going forwards?
Yeah, so I don't think it needs to be true, because like I'm a physicist by training, and ultimately what is the ultimate resource is basically free energy in the universe. And you can use that free energy to turn into everything else what you want. And I do think that kind of thinking about our current resource limits as they are kind of limited to particular places on this planet is like very, very parochial. So it's like if things go well, they could go like really well. And moreover, I do think that actually co-founder of DeepMind, Shane Legg, once told me that people deal with change by forgetting how different things were in the past and assuming that the future will be just like today. No, like as we heard, things were much different in the past, and I think we shouldn't underestimate how different they could be in the future, both in good or bad ways.
Okay, but talk to me in terms of specifics, though. Are we just talking about, I don't know, scarcity of water by and solving that problem by taking salt out of seawater? I mean, what are we actually talking about here?
So, I mean, ultimately, like as we discussed a little bit in the green room, like there is this interesting coincidence that there are roughly the same number of people than there are reachable galaxies. So, like technically, everyone could have their own galaxy, assuming no more people are kind of competing for this resource. But this is the amount of like, this is the potential. This is the illustration of potential.
So we're thinking too small to just want to own your own two-bedroom flat in London.
Exactly. Exactly.
Have your own galaxy.
Yes.
Do you actually think that there's a potential? I mean, we're talking at the very optimistic end of the spectrum here. But do you think that there is a version of the future where we get to harness more from the galaxy, more from the universe?
I mean, that's a potential. So, like, don't tempt me to get into the negative stuff. So, yeah, and it could be like, in some ways, it could be even like bigger because having a galaxy to yourself and just using it as a physical galaxy is again enormous waste, because like almost everything that the atoms in this galaxy are doing is basically nothing. They're just like bumping against each other instead of like creating like wonderful virtual worlds or like experiences or things like that.
I do wonder though, Will, when we think about the future, it does feel as though questions of existential risk, which we're going to come on to in a moment, do feel a little bit more present. Is there a danger that we don't imagine the extremely optimistic end of things as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should have the balance where, the future, it might be dystopian, where, things could be much, much worse in the future than they are today. I think there's a variety of ways that could happen. There might be nothing at all, because we've just ended civilization or the human species at all. But things could be extremely good, and I think that is important to think about. So there are so many things, and I often reflect on this, like I was on the tube today, and you're stuffed against people, and it's hot, and it's unpleasant, and people cough, and they might make you sick. You feel pain. You have to work doing like menial jobs that you don't enjoy in order to get a paycheck. All of these things that we take utterly for granted as part of life are just contingent. They don't need to be that way. And it might well be that people in the future look back and are horrified at the thought of getting sick or unwell, horrified at the thought of having to work for some corporation that you don't like just to be able to pay the bills. And I think with continued technological progress, if we navigate the threats that we face, then it really could be the case that everyone is free from suffering, able to live very long, healthy lives, basically of whatever way they choose. And that positive vision is something that we could produce if we choose.
And in terms of the climate then, Hannah, which I know is really your proper specialty, can you paint me a positive picture of the future? What's the optimistic vision that we could aim for?
The optimistic vision is that part of the push to reduce our carbon emissions and move away from fossil fuels has almost forced us towards energy sources that could be much more fruitful and much more sustainable at a really large scale than we've had from fossil fuels. So there's always talk of, we're going to reach peak oil, we're going to reach peak coal, etc. And we've always had that. And they've always proven to be wrong because we find new resources. But these are not infinite resources. We would run out of these resources eventually. What we're doing now on trying to address climate change is actually moving towards resources that actually could produce energy at a much, much, much larger level. So as Will says, part of the way we think about climate change, and I think about global energy currently, is can we make sure that the poorer countries in the world, they manage to come to a standard of living that we have and consume the amount of energy that we have, and can we continue the way we currently work in a more sustainable way through low carbon energy resources. But again, that's to some extent a very pessimistic view. That's not looking at could we actually just take everyone much, much higher.
Yeah. Well, then I wonder though, because, okay, so I guess if all of you there have helped to paint this optimistic version, there is optimism to be had. I wonder about the kind of conversations that we're having, Hannah. I wonder about the type of media narratives, particularly around climate change, and how media approaches stories, whether there is sort of an under-optimistic bias to it, as it were.
I think there's definitely a balance there. In the media, I've been very happy because climate change has got a lot more media attention. I don't always agree with how the climate change debate is framed in the media. It's often around reporting rising temperatures, rising CO2, often without a focus on solutions, and often without comparing where we've been to where we are now. So there's often this assumption that we've made no progress over the last decade and we're still in the same position as we were 10 years ago. That's simply not true. And I think one of the challenges I find with some of the media narrative is not always completely in line with the science. And one example I use here is the 1.5 degree target, where in the Paris Agreement, we've set this target of to limit global warming well below 2 degrees and as far as possible try to limit it below 1.5. Now, often the way that's portrayed in the media is once we reach 1.5, it's over. Right, it's like this deadline of like, this is a threshold. Once we go past that threshold, it's over. And often that comes through in people's understanding of the problem. Now, the reality is we're not going to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees. I'm like often a climate optimist, but we're just not going to do that. We're not going to be able to do this in time. Now, the problem that creates is that if I really believed that 1.5 degree was this threshold, that once there's no point of return beyond it, then I would be incredibly pessimistic, and there would actually be no case for even trying to pursue efforts to do that. That's just not the case. Once we go past 1.5 degrees, it's not this like threshold or this cliff that we fall off. We need to fight for 1.6 and 1.7 and 1.8, because with every incremental 0.1 degree, the risks of climate impacts increase. So I think while I like the amount of attention climate change is now getting in the media, I think there's ways that we can frame this debate better.
It risks people becoming fatalistic, as it were.
Yeah.
That this is just a foregone conclusion.
Either fatalistic, of they just give up and they become paralyzed because we're not going to reach it, or we reach for really extreme solutions and really divisive solutions, which actually in the end are not solutions because we need everyone to get on board. If we're going to tackle climate change, we need most people to get on board and come with us. And when we propose these really divisive solutions, it actually just creates even further divisions and actually stops progress.
Will, I saw you nodding along as Hannah was talking there. Is there something you want to jump in on?
Yeah, I mean, just the issue is that, like, the media has systematically got more negative over the past couple of decades. And I think that's partly because media companies are getting better at learning what are the stories that kind of sell, that go viral, as it were. And unfortunately, given human psychology, that's very systematically negative. So stories about solutions, stories about the fact that the cost of solar energy is down by, I think, a factor of 17 times over the last couple of decades, and is now really set to become a large source of energy, displacing a lot of fossil fuels. That is not a message that is widely spread, even though it's just of crucial importance if you want to understand the progress that we are making on climate change, and is in fact much more motivating, because if you just think that the world is going to hell in a handbasket and there's nothing we can do about it, well, you're just going to feel sad. You're not going to want to take action by donating to good places or working on the problems yourself.
Yeah, and I want to come to you with a similar question about the media narratives around artificial intelligence, because it does feel, as Will was mentioning, that there's this sort of quite, everyone's like a little bit scared and it's sort of a little bit nervous, the media in particular. But then there's a disconnect between the sort of stories about existential threat and then what people can actually see and feel and get their hands on, namely ChatGPT. How do you, what do you think about how the media is framing these narratives as it comes to the future of AI?
So I think my general frustration about media, but it's just a discourse in general, so I'm not even sure if this is like media's fault, is again this like kind of not realizing that things change. So it's like there is this assumption that like GPT-5 will basically be like GPT-4. Even though like the difference between GPT-2 and GPT-3 was massive, and again, like the difference between GPT-3 and 4 was massive. So like, why assume that now things are kind of like set, and I have to think about like how do we change our education system to kind of use GPT-4 from now until forever, or like more generally thinking about how can we, well, assuming that we will have to live for 100 years with an AI that is good enough to teach us things, but not good enough to do them themselves, without realizing that this is like a very narrow capabilities range that is like very unlikely to stay for a long time in.
So then it sort of just sounds like what you're describing is that we're just talking about the wrong things altogether.
Well, I mean, we're talking about right things with a wrong assumption. So it's like the assumption is like, well, I mean, there is like interesting kind of tension. Like from one hand, I think people are kind of like making the wrong assumption that AI will not change. That said, I'm the guy who kind of contributed to the pause letter. So in some ways, I'm trying to stop AI from advancing too quickly. So like, I don't want to criticize people too much for assuming that AI will be paused, because I really hope it will.
This is the letter that asked everybody to stop research for 6 months.
Yeah.
Why specifically was 6 months chosen?
Yes, and we had like at the Future of Life Institute, which I also have co-founded, we had quite a lot of back and forth about like, should we have like a concrete period there or not? Or should it be like indefinite? And there were like two reasons why we ended up putting in a concrete period. One was we expected that the main counter-argument we're going to receive is, but China. Like, what about China? Because like China currently is behind, when it comes to the frontier models, we thought that putting in like some concrete short period would be like safer ask. And the other thing is that it would be kind of more revealing. If you fail to get a pause, it would be more revealing of the current situation if the ask was lower and we couldn't even get the small pause.
And then how did you find the conversations around that idea? How did you, in terms of like the national conversations that we're all having, how did you find them?
I mean, we were totally blown away. It's like there's one of my favorite tweets that I saw was that something about like the dinner conversation in somewhere like in rural Kansas, apparently. Like 3 questions, like is the quarry hiring? How's the tenderloin? And is 6 months enough?
Wow.
So yeah, that kind of how much I kind of had some reasons to believe that this might resonate, because I kept like hearing more and more people in like AI circles being very uneasy about the situation. And then like one of the motivations behind the open letter was to kind of like put out some like flag that, okay, anyone who is kind of concerned can basically point to that flag. And sure enough, there were like millions of people. We got like over like, I mean, we got something like 60,000 signatures, but because we really weren't able to handle all the things on the technical side, a lot of people ended up like just signing multiple times in the hopes of like that the signature shows up. So at some point, we basically kind of cleaned things up, and it are like 30,000 something.
You said something backstage. You said that there's a strange gap in the middle about the fear of existential risk.
Yeah, so there is this, there have been like multiple surveys of ordinary people in US and UK, and perhaps elsewhere. And there's like someone who has been talking about existential risks for more than a decade to various audiences. Like, it's kind of frustrating that there is like sort of a gap in the middle who are like the hard cases. It's very easy to explain that having something that is smarter than you on this planet and having to share the planet with you, it's easy to like to explain it to like most like ordinary people. They say things like oh, if I train a dog, of course I'm not going to leave Kid alone with that dog without supervision. And then like the experts like Joshua Benji or Jeff Hinton, which was great that he kind of started contributing, they're also very concerned. And then like some people in academia, they're like, oh yeah, I mean, I don't want to like be like too dismissive here, but like I can sometimes say like they just want to sound smart, so they don't want to like face the obvious.
So it's the dinner party conversation at one end, and the like real sort of high-end AI people at the other end, and then the rest of us in the middle are not losing enough sleep over this.
Yeah.
I want to come back to the things that particularly keep you awake and worrying in a moment. But Hannah, on this idea of real concerns then, of things that we really do need to be concerned about, the most pressing environmental problems, what are the things that keep you awake at night?
So I can start with the climate point. I am very concerned about climate change. We're not on track to meet our climate targets. We won't keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees. The only way we would achieve that is if we go past it. It's called an overshoot, so overshoot past it, and then basically with negative emissions manage to like bring it back. That case for me seems very unlikely. We're not on track for 2 degrees. So we currently are citing a warming of 1.2 degrees. And the current trajectory we're on based on current policies that have been implemented is around 2.5 degrees. Now, 2.5 degrees is very bad, and is as bad as it is. But there's also what we call climate sensitivity around that, where 2.5 degrees is the most likely outcome given our emissions trajectory. But the climate system is complex, and there's a curve around that, and there's tails. And 2.5 degrees, it's unlikely, but it's possible that 2.5 degrees could be 4 degrees, and a 4-degree world is really not a good world. And I don't think we should be rolling that dice. We don't know how the climate will respond, but we don't want to roll that dice. So I'm very concerned about the current trajectory we're on, and with the uncertainty of that it could actually be much, much more than what we're banking on.
These things also don't scale linearly, right? So extreme weather events that we're already witnessing, it's not that from 1.2 to 2.5 it's twice as bad.
No, it's a non-linear trend, and often they're unpredictable, so it's non-linear, and you also just don't know where it's coming and when it's coming, which is the issue. The other big issue with climate change is that, as we discussed, there's still a large number of people in the world that are incredibly poor, and one of the main adaptation measures is actually just not living in poverty. So over the last century, we've actually seen a dramatic decline in the number of deaths from disasters. And that's not because disasters are decreasing or becoming less intense. It's because we become resilient to them. We have early warning systems, we have better infrastructure, we can recover when a disaster strikes. The poorest people in the world are much less able to do that. So the problem with climate change is that we already have a large number of people that don't have the resilience to respond, and they be put on top of them climate impacts. So that's climate change, which is bad enough. But I actually think some of the underrated environmental problems, the big one is air pollution. So there are a range of estimates, but they're in the millions. Around the median estimate I see is around 7 million people die from air pollution every year, which is far more than currently die from climate change. So to some extent, air pollution is a much more pressing problem. And the good news is that the solutions to both climate change and air pollution are essentially the same, which is to move away from fossil fuels. So there are positives there that to tackle a lot of these problems, the solutions are essentially the same. But I think to some extent we focus a little bit too much on climate change and we miss some of the problems that are here and now.
Food scarcity being another one.
Food scarcity being another one. The problem with food scarcity is not about food production. So when you look at the amount of food that the world produces, we could probably feed everyone in the world around 5,000 calories a day, which is like twice the amount that we need. The problem is that there's a massive difference from what we produce to what actually ends at the end of the chain, and that's because we waste food along the way, we feed food to animals, which is a very, very inefficient process in converting that into actual meat, and we put crops into cars. So it's not a problem of food production, it's a problem of what we're using that food for and the global distribution of that food.
Jaan, I want to come back to you and just ask you now, in terms of the things that really concern you about potential threats for our future, what are the things that play on your mind? I mean,
so the big thing that concerns me right now is just the fact that the AI field, so the AI as a paradigm, has become more and more black boxy over time to the point that currently we are not building AIs, we are growing them. So we are basically taking something like a few hundred-line piece of script like that can fit on a couple of pages, put them on tens of thousands of graphics cards, and then like basically let them hum for weeks or months unattended, and then like kind of stop, open up the hood, and see like what kind of creature grew in this cellar. So it's, and I think sort of just this paradigm I have like a lot of issues with. Like I've been saying that there's a big difference between aliens and AI in the sense that if you get like super intelligent aliens, we don't get to choose which kind of aliens we're going to visit us if there will be aliens. But we kind of, in theory, have the degree of freedom of what kind of AI we'll be building. And we are not using that degree of freedom currently. We're just like growing AIs and seeing what happens.
In really tangible ways, though. I mean, I hear what you're saying about you know, the idea that you're growing and coming back and seeing what's been created, as it were. But in a tangible way, why does that concern you?
So, like, okay, stepping like down like one level of abstraction. People assume quite a lot that there's like very big difference between kind of accidents and misuse risk. Like some people say that like, well, we shouldn't like constrain or pause anything that happens in the training, like in the what kind of AIs can we build. We should like constrain how they're used. Well, that kind of assumes that there's like a very big difference or very hard step, which is called deployment. Like that this is something that only humans can do. Well, in fact, like what deployment means, deployment is sending a bunch of computer commands. So and like I mean, personally, I use GPT to help to configure my firewall at home. So like it knows about these things. It's not something that like, oh, I need to be deployed. Okay, guess I can't do that now. So it's like we're kind of growing general capabilities and kind of assuming that these capabilities will not be there. So that's like, and then like when it goes like even more kind of concrete, like there's more and more discussions and concerns about the AI and synthetic bio. Like if it kind of either breaks out, self-deploys, or like gets into wrong hands, it just might make it easier to create like biological agents.
And this in a situation where you have artificial intelligence that doesn't understand context or nuance, doesn't have values that are aligned with humans, that's the ultimate.
Yeah, either it doesn't understand, it's kind of like does the dumb thing, like, or it understands it like too well and kind of realizes like one big obstacle on its way is like either humans just directly or just the particular environment. Like for example, we're concerned about global warming. I mean, for AI, like if it wants to kind of get rid of the waste heat that it would create on this planet potentially by building lots of data centers and kind of other computing mechanisms, like evacuating the atmosphere, getting rid of the atmosphere might be like a reasonable thing from its perspective because it certainly doesn't need the atmosphere, right?
Absolutely. What kind of probabilities do you put on this as a version of our future?
Yes, this is super hard. In kind of our circles, it's known as what's your B-doom, probability of doom. Like, it's very hard to answer that, like because for two reasons. Like one is that I'm actively trying to lower the probability of doom. So it's like in some ways I'm kind of have to assume that I'm not doing anything about it or something, which I'm not assuming. And the other thing is like the future is like very uncertain. So like I can kind of answer like, okay, if something happens today, what is the probability of good outcome? And I think it's like almost zero. Like it's almost certain that like something that is non-human on this planet and is smarter than humans, it's just not going to leave the planet livable for biologicals like us.
Good.
Hopefully it's not going to be today, right?
Well, sure. Yeah, I mean, hopefully we'll get to midnight. Will, how much does this stuff play on your mind? And then, but then also, in addition to that, I mean, how much are you worrying about these things? But on top of that, how do you balance those kinds of concerns? How do you take one existential risk and another and decide which one, is a more pressing problem?
Sure. So, I mean, in terms of how much I worry about this stuff, it's quite a lot, and it's a lot more, especially in the near term, as a result of the last couple of years. So I was very surprised, as was most of the machine learning community, in fact, by the sheer capabilities of GPT 3.5 and GPT 4, where they really display like high-level reasoning abilities. And that really seems to be as a result of just throwing more computing power at training these models. And then it's just not a hard extrapolation. You look over the next 10 years, you look at the plans for just buying a lot more chips, basically, bigger supercomputers that are more efficient. And we should expect, or at least prepare for, over the next 10 years, these models to be trained with something like 10 million times as much computing power. And then if you tell me, well, maybe we get, over that period, to the point at which AI systems can really help in a very significant way to develop better AI systems that themselves can then create, help to develop better AI systems. For the first time in my life, I would feel not at all surprised if that point came in the next 5 years or 10 years. And that means that just things could happen very quickly. It's like you're having to deal with many centuries worth of technological progress, all happening in the course of a year or 2 years. And that poses this range of risks. Jaan mentioned synthetic biology. I can already ask a jailbroken GPT-4 to give me the design of a smallpox virus. Thankfully, it's not smart enough to really be very helpful at the moment, but GPT-6, GPT-7 could be extremely good at that. But then, as Jaan says, there's also the worry that just we lose control to the AI systems themselves. We build AI into the whole economy, and that economy is just now much larger than humans are. And yeah, perhaps a livable planet from the perspective of humans is not the optimal thing from the perspective of the AIs. So I worry about that greatly. You asked this question about prioritization, and it's tough. I mean, we got effective altruism off the ground focused on very robustly measurable ways of doing good. Things like the humble bed net, which can save a life for a few thousand pounds, and where we absolutely know how it works. We know that it will protect children against malaria, and that will help prevent them from dying. Whereas when we're tackling existential threats, certainly from AI, but also from other things like synthetic biology, from nuclear war, things get much murkier. And you have to start relying on expert judgment that you perhaps aggregate. So there are these incredible surveys done of machine learning researchers with these striking conclusions that half of machine learning researchers think there's a 10% chance of existential catastrophe from AI. Or you look at like forecasting tournaments as well. So there are these professional forecasters, people who are just very good at making predictions, at least on the order of a few years. And that can help you to get a bit of a sense of which are the largest risks. And when you do that, it does tend to be the case that people worry most about artificial intelligence with risks from the ability to design new viruses from synthetic biology, often coming second, in terms of ways that things could go extremely badly wrong.
This hasn't quite taken the optimistic turn that I was. I mean, no one was really expecting it. But Hannah, do you think that when it comes to the problems that you're describing, do you think that there's hope that science can save us?
Yes, I think as we discussed earlier, one of my issues with the narrative around climate is it's basically focused on the problem and not enough on the solutions. And we haven't properly acknowledged actually how far we've come, even in the last decade. Where we are today is so different from where we were a decade ago. To tackle climate change, we need cheap, low-carbon energy. And if you go back a decade, solar and wind were the most expensive energy technologies we had, which is why countries were not deploying them. Over the last decade, the price of solar has fallen by 90%, the price of wind has fallen by 70%, and they're now the cheapest. So from that perspective, you don't even need people to believe in climate change to choose those options. So that's one, they don't need to believe in climate change to choose those options, because it's just economical to do so. But you also match that with this question of how do you lift people out of poverty and tackle that with the dilemma of, as they move out of poverty, their resource footprint increases and their CO2 emissions increase. There's no longer that trade-off when you have these technologies so cheap. The same applies to batteries, where we've seen dramatic decline, where a decade ago electric vehicles were incredibly expensive and they're now getting cost competitive. So I think where I see hope there is that I wish everyone was just felt morally obliged to do this because just for the future of the earth and the climate. But I think we're now getting to the stage where they don't even need to believe in that for it to happen. They're just going to do that because it's the economic choice to do so.
Because the incentives align with what's actually right for everybody.
Yeah.
Jaan, what do you think? Do you think science can save us?
Oh yeah, it can, in principle. It also can kill us.
But what about, there was one...
It's a powerful thing, right?
It's a very powerful thing. In what ways do you think that science can save us then?
So I've been, for the last 10 years, supporting the kind of AI alignment research, which is basically how do you, in principle, figure out how to motivate something that is smarter than you, which I think there have been some interesting ideas along the way, but not enough to be kind of ready on time, as it seems.
That's interesting, actually, that that idea of motivation came up, because essentially you're saying the same thing, right? That it's like you have to make it so that the motivation of the individual ends up being the right thing overall, and the way you're describing.
And AI is like really big kind of like difference. Like current AI paradigm is selecting AIs for behavior, not for motivation, and like we don't know how to select for motivation.
And in terms of motivation, Will, in terms of the effective altruism movement, which actually, I mean, there's a lot of it about focus on charity and giving and you know, giving up a lot of your income. How do you motivate people to do that? How do you encourage this sort of contagious nature of being good citizens?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the key thing is just focusing on the positive. So I know this panel has talked a lot about the negatives. I mean, when it comes to AI, for example, like I am quite a bit more optimistic, I think, than Jaan. Like, you know, it was 10 years ago or something, I remember sitting in these seminars in Oxford talking about AI risk, and it felt like the fringiest of fringe concerns. Like, no one was worrying about this now. It's just 10 years later, 15 years later, and there's this large, vibrant research field on technical AI alignment, some of the brightest people around the world working to try and figure out how can we make these systems safe. Like the UK government at the moment has a task force dedicated to exactly the question of how can we safely navigate the development of advanced artificial intelligence. This is a problem that like we can solve, and I think with effort we will. And yeah, in general, I think there is this issue when it comes to like trying to encourage people to do good, whether that's in AI or climate and so on. And people just say, wow, the problem is so bad. Like, I remember this as a charity fundraiser. You just say, all these millions of children who are dying every year, and people just think, wow, that sucks, and don't feel motivated. But instead, we can say, look, clean technology can make, not only can it reduce climate change, it can also stop 7 million people a year dying from air pollution. It can also reduce the cost of energy in poor countries. Similarly with AI, if we solve the alignment problem, then not only can we keep the Earth habitable for human beings, but again, we would never need to work an unpleasant day in our lives. Like, this is actually something that is possible, but it just requires people to get out of our seats and and contribute, whether that's through our donations, through the work we do, through advocacy we do on social media or at the ballot box.
And I guess that's something that can become contagious.
Yeah, and I think it has been.
So just the final thought to leave you with about the idea of contagious optimism. Jaan, I heard a rumor about Jaan that he is a extremely good dancer and has a little trick where he goes into nightclubs and then basically creates contagious optimism inside a nightclub. Is that right, Jaan? And are there any lessons that we can learn from that?
Dancing is my main hobby. In fact, like a few weeks ago, I talked to like one of the leading AI labs, heads of them, and they were like very excited about how big AI experiments they're currently building. And I'm like, okay, I guess I have to dance more now. I can, as long as I can.
Is it true that you go in somewhere, kind of dance around until everybody in the entire club is dancing together and then just leave? And then
I could write the book about that. So it's like, I mean, sometimes it works like that, sometimes it works less well, but like...
So basically what we need to do is that, but for the whole world. That's okay.
Sorry?
We need to do that, but for the whole world, about optimism and motivation to be optimistic.
Dancing is amazing, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed to my panel, and thank you
Thank you.
to all of you. Thank you.
Thanks so much.